Welcome to Adventures in Relationship, a psychoeducational show about healthy relationships for adults with complex trauma. I'm Amy Gordon, an individual and couple psychotherapist working on unceded Tiwa land in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I also offer virtual therapy, so reach out if you'd like to work with me individually or as a couple. I'm rocking my rainbows today, so I'll remind viewers and listeners, because I haven't in a while, that I'm queer and I specialize in working with queer individuals and relationships. I work with some straight folks too, but a lot of straight relationships, in quotes for the listeners, are queer relationships anyway. And that's IYKYK. But anyway, I wanted to follow up on my last episode because this content kept crossing my mind after I recorded the last one. So, did you know that attachment styles are associated with certain personality disorders? In their most extreme manifestations, it's thought that disorganized attachment becomes antisocial personality disorder, anxious attachment becomes borderline personality disorder, and avoidant attachment becomes narcissistic personality disorder. I want to mention that some folks prefer the term fearful avoidant to disorganized, but as a disorganized attacher in recovery myself, I can say that I think the term disorganized makes perfect sense. And I think it can be easily confused for people who are just learning about attachment when we're using two different avoidance styles. So when folks use fearful avoidant to describe disorganized attachment, they usually delineate fearful avoidant from dismissive avoidant. So dismissive avoidant is what we think of typically when we say avoidant attachment. Anyway, I'm going to be using the term disorganized. I usually default to that term, and I just wanted to speak to it because some folks find it pejorative, and I just want to honor that for what it's worth. So I'm going to go ahead and read out of the DSM when it comes to antisocial personality disorder, when we get there at least. But if you want to hear the criteria for borderline personality disorder or narcissistic personality disorder, check out my previous episode titled What You Need to Know About Personality Disorders. I'm just going to read about antisocial today because I didn't in that one. This personality disorder and attachment style theory is based on James Masterson's work. He's basically the most well-respected theorist regarding personality disorders and their roots being in attachment rupture and childhood trauma. He created a triad model explaining personality disordered behavior essentially being triggered by self-activation, which leads to abandonment depression, which then results in disordered defensive strategies. So I'll talk about those terms a little bit, but this triad can also be helpful if you replace the personality disordered behavior with the insecure attachment behavior. The model still works there. Abandonment depression might more accurately be described as attachment anxiety, and sometimes it is referred to as attachment anxiety. But it's basically what happens when a person's true and authentic self tries to come online to maybe initiate direction, set boundaries, or be truly authentically creative. But during these folks' childhoods, authenticity was punished. So these extremely powerful defensive strategies get activated in people with insecure attachment and, of course, the extreme manifestations in personality disorders. The exposure of vulnerable authenticity elicits this panic that then triggers the often dysfunctional protective patterns that were basically habituated starting in childhood. And self-activation refers to just the healthy natural instinct to, like I said before, initiate directions, set boundaries, or be truly creative. So self-activation in your relationships might look like declining an invitation, asserting an opinion, or expressing something vulnerable. I work a lot with this idea, the idea of self-activation in my practice with couples. For anxious attachers, sometimes this looks like encouraging them to actually declare what they want in their relationship. For avoidant attachers, this often looks like helping them learn to collaborate with their partner around how they manage privacy or alone time. And with disorganized attachers, this might look like supporting them in becoming more expressive about their fears and certainly their needs. In a broader sense, self activation refers to any movement toward individuation or self actualization. It's the instinct to exist with a fair sense of entitlement as a unique person with unique contributions and needs. We know that attachment styles are adaptations to relating within our family of origin, and personality disorders are really a reasonable and innovative way to organize the self given particularly unsafe, dysfunctional upbringings. And attachment plays a major role in whether self activation feels possible or fundamentally dangerous. With the different insecure attachment styles, we see varying strategies for preserving a sense of safety within relationship. And the same principle applies to their extreme forms of antisocial, borderline, and narcissistic personality disorder. Each one reflects a different solution to the same early problem: how to be a self in the presence of others without suffering immense psychological torment. I'll start by breaking down antisocial personality disorder and disorganized attachment. So I'm going to go ahead and read the diagnostic criteria for the personality disorder. My handy dandy DSM. This is a little bit different than some of the other personality disorders that are like you need to meet 5 out of 9 criteria. They're simple. This one's got A, B, C, D, and then so within that. So anyway, I'll read it to you, but it's a little more complicated. So the diagnostic criteria for antisocial personality disorder reads: a pervasive pattern of disregard for and violation of the rights of others occurring since age 15, as indicated by 3 or more of the following. 1, failure to conform to social norms with respect to lawful behaviors, as indicated by repeatedly performing acts that are grounds for arrest. 2, deceitfulness, as indicated by repeated lying, use of aliases, or conning others for personal profit or pleasure. 3, impulsivity or failure to plan ahead. 4, irritability and aggressiveness, as indicated by repeated physical fights or assaults. 5, reckless disregard for safety of self and others. 6, consistent irresponsibility, as indicated by repeated failure to sustain consistent work behavior or honor financial obligations. And 7, lack of remorse, as indicated by being indifferent to or rationalizing having hurt, mistreated, or stolen from another. B, the individual is at least 18 years of age. C, there is evidence of conduct disorder with onset before 15 years old. And D, the occurrence of antisocial behavior is not exclusively during the course of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. So, yeah, that's the diagnostic criteria. Disorganized attachment forms when caregivers are frightening, chaotic, abusive, or entirely absent. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the childhood contexts that tend to form different attachment styles, because I've done that in other episodes and there's a lot of information out there. So definitely look into it if you want to hear more about that. But essentially, the child has no reliable strategy. Sometimes approach leads to danger. Sometimes avoidance leads to danger. And there's no safe, consistent strategy for getting relational needs met. Their nervous system quickly learns to stop organizing around connection and shifts toward survival. The child can't predict care. The child can't internalize regulation because of that. And the developing self never stabilizes. So here's the challenge. When the self activates, there's no internal structure to contain that energy. Activation doesn't feel creative or directed. It feels overwhelming, flooding, and destabilizing. Without an internal soothing presence, as sufficient parenting provides, energy discharges outward instead of organizing inward. That is to say, with disorganized attachment, we see explosive externalization of strong emotions. And the more extreme the developmental trauma, the more extreme those varying aspects of impulsivity get. Uh, Also associated with disorganized attachment, which I don't particularly identify with, but in kind of the typical, the most common features of folks with disorganized attachment, aggression and dominance, violation of boundaries, and some disregard for the consequences. And this is antisocial pathology. It's activation without integration. It's not an absence of self, but it's a self that never learned how to come online safely. With borderline personality disorder and anxious attachment, the dysfunction forms when caregivers are inconsistent, sometimes attuned, sometimes unavailable. Love is intermittently present, but frustratingly unreliable. And that child learns that connecting is unsafe because connection vanishes without warning. And so the self organizes around proximity. The self activation dilemma for an anxious attacher is that when the self begins to activate, fear of withdrawal and rejection immediately follows. Any movement toward independence can feel like a threat to connection. The nervous system interprets separation as danger. So action becomes oriented around others. You could even say organized around others, not around a sense of internal direction. Decisions are driven by a question of, will you stay with me? And self activation triggers emotional flooding, panic, clinging, rage, despair, and frantic attempts at repair. Because disappointing others or being alone feels existentially threatening, not because the person's weak, but because attachment taught them that being a self is a threat to relationships. Now, with narcissistic personality disorder and avoidant attachment, forms when caregivers dismiss developmentally appropriate attachment values and overemphasize self sufficiency. Needs are minimized, emotions are ignored and shamed, and independence is prematurely demanded. The child learns to deactivate their awareness of emotional needs and rely on performance or image for affirmation of connection. Their sense of value becomes conditional. The self activation issue here is a little more subtle. Activation is allowed, but only in the rigid and narrow lanes of achievement, status, control, admiration, and even superiority. So these forms of activation are rewarded, but vulnerability is not. So authentic self expression feels dangerous because it risks exposure and shame. So activation comes from a false self, not a true self. Movement without intimacy, success without authenticity, and confidence without contact. Their true self remains split off, protected by grandiosity and control. So, antisocial personality disorder is essentially an extreme version of disorganized attachment, this chaotic activation without containment. Borderline personality disorder is essentially an extreme version of anxious attachment, activation hijacked by a fear of abandonment. And narcissistic personality disorder is essentially an extreme version of avoidant attachment, restricted activation in an unconscious attempt to avoid vulnerability. Three different solutions to the same fundamental problem of being in relationship when the relationships of childhood instilled massive wounding. All three share something important. When the true self tries to emerge, it is met with intense anxiety, not ordinary anxiety, existential anxiety, fear of annihilation, fear of abandonment, fear of shame. The body reacts as if selfhood itself is dangerous. And that's why change is really difficult. not because people don't want to grow, but because growth activates early danger signals wired into their attachment system. The nervous system remembers what it cost once to want, to act, and to be separate. Understanding this brings us to the question of how do we support the self as it learns to activate without terror? How do we help the nervous system tolerate selfhood in the presence of others? How do we build this capacity? And that's where the real healing happens, not through control or shame or compliance, but through relationship, attunement, and a slow evolution of our capacity to self activate, learning that it's possible to desire, to move toward individual goals, to assert boundaries, and to remain connected. I really appreciate you taking the time to watch or listen to this episode. Please get professional help locally or online if you're struggling. I'm a therapist. I'm probably not your therapist, and this isn't therapy. Please don't rely on podcasts or webcasts as your primary mental health support. Take good care of yourself and your partner if you're committed. You do not have to abandon yourself to do so. My mission is to help adults with complex trauma find emotional freedom and learn how to thrive in relationships. So if you can take a moment to follow, rate, review, or share this episode, it's immensely helpful. Thank you for watching or listening. Until next time.